thank you, Dean, for being here and supporting the program and the seminars. And I want to welcome you this evening. And this is, as you know, part of our public policy seminar series. And we're here to introduce and welcome Dr. Erroll Southers from the University of Southern California. He has an extensive list of accomplishments and a very well-defined background, which I'm going to share with you in a little bit. And the talk tonight is on the global threat of homegrown violent extremism. But before we kind of start, let me kind of share with you some of what we will do tonight. We'll have Dr. Southers come up and speak, and then we'll have some time for question and answer in the end. I'm sure all of you will have many questions or thoughts you wish to share, and I know that he's willing to answer and respond and share with all of you. So let me give you a little bit of background on Dr. Southers, who I've known for many years and respect very much. He was a former FBI special agent, the director of Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies, and an adjunct professor in the Sikh Communities Institute at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at USC. He is also the Director of International Programs for the Department of Homeland Security National Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, and it's called CREATE. Dr. Southers was President Barack Obama's first nominee for Transportation Security Administration Assistant Secretary and Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's Deputy Director for Critical Infrastructure of California Office of Homeland Security. He also served as the Assistant Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence at the Los Angeles World Airports Department, police officer and gang investigator with the Santa Monica Police Department, and he's a distinct member of the FBI SWAT team. Dr. Southers has testified before full congressional committees on Homeland Security as a subject matter expert. He is the author of Homegrown Violent Extremism, a noted counterterrorism expert and security analyst for a variety of media networks, lecturers, and consultants around the world. In fact, personally, I've seen him on many interviews at the CNN level, and so clearly has a distinct and distinguished background. Dr. Southers earned his undergraduate degree from Brown University, and he holds a master's and doctoral degree in public policy from USC. We're honored to have you here, Dr. Southers, and so at this time I'm going to invite you up.
That's true. Okay, so Brian, thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Dean, thank you for coming. I want to thank the students that put this together. They've been working with me for a long time. I appreciate you dealing with my crazy schedule. I'm like your dean. I never know. I'm never more than a week away from getting on an airplane. I probably should have been a pilot in another life. But it's an honor and a privilege to be here. As Brian mentioned, going through my background, I'm really humbled by the things I've been able to do. And I'm going to say this since I'm speaking to the School of Public Policy. I would not be able to do what I do were it not for my public service. So for those of you who are interested in public service, kudos to you. If there's any way or anything you need from me in the way of talking to me or counsel, I tell my students the same thing. There's no service like public service. And we can talk about what I would have done if I had been in the administration. I go to countries and teach in countries like Israel where they have a commitment to public service for a certain number of years to their country, and I think we can certainly benefit from that. But that's a subject for another time. So, as Brian mentioned, I do get to do a little bit of media. Unfortunately, the folks in the studios always say, we love to see you, but whenever you show up, we know it's something bad. But that just goes with the territory. So what we're going to talk about tonight is homegrown violent extremism. I am going to work through a couple of different domain spaces, and you can stop me along the way. We're slated to go for a lecture and a Q&A, but I just think it's better if I get onto a topic or a slide and you find interesting, have a question, please don't hesitate, because that's why I'm here. Okay? All right, great. So the story begins this way. As was mentioned, I spent a number of years on SWAT in the FBI. I spent the majority of my FBI career undercover, So when we trained at one of the firing ranges in San Diego, and I was on the San Diego SWAT team and in the San Diego division of the FBI, we went to a range, a firing range that was in Fallbrook. And if you know anything about San Diego, Fallbrook is a county where when I was in the FBI, Tom Metzger was still there. He was still burning crosses for the Klan, and we had a number of investigations we were running. So it was just as well because I had to be on a range where we couldn't drive to places where people knew me and things like that. So I'm driving home from the range one day. I'm sitting at a traffic light, and let me ask you a question. So do we need the mic for the video or not? Because if we don't, I'll wander. So we need to ask them. No, I'm saying, can I wander, or do I have to be at the mic?
I think they need it.
They need it for the video? Okay, I'll stay here. I'm like Kenny G, you know, I gotta wander around, so I'll stay here. So I'm at a traffic light, and I'm sitting there. I'm in that black t-shirt. I'm in those camouflage pants. I've got, at that time, a 6-hour 9mm on my hip. I've got an MP5 submachine gun in the case on the seat. I've got an M16 in the trunk and a shotgun and a whole lot of other good stuff. And I'm minding my own business, and these two guys pull up, and out of the corner of my eye, I can see they're making faces, they're flipping me off, they're doing all kinds of things, and I'm just focused on this light saying, this has got to be the longest red light in San Diego. And I'm also saying, and they're lucky that it's me. Finally, as the light almost turns green, I just about turn my head when one of them does this. And it made me realize, oops, hold on guys, we went way too far ahead here. Sorry. One of them did that. And it made me realize that the threats that we are dealing with and the issues we have to investigate, the challenges we face, are sometimes closer than we think. You probably remember 9/11. I'm like one of those people, and I'm often reminded now by my students when I say, you know, 9/11. I teach a Homeland Security and Public Policy class in the graduate school, and I start with 9/11. And it shocks me because 2 years ago I had a student say, Professor, you know, with all due respect, I was in the 6th grade when that happened. So as we get further and further away from this event, I have to remind myself and remind them about how America changed. In 1993, there was an attack on the World Trade Center. Ramzi Youssef had a truck bomb. He's the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the #3 individual in Al-Qaeda. And after doing this, the federal marshals caught him. They're transporting him over Manhattan in a helicopter, and one of the guys in the helicopter says, the marshal says to him, "We thought you were going to bring that down." He said, "Don't worry, next time we will." On September 11, 2000, a year before the attack to the day, I'm in Orlando, Florida, making a videotape on domestic terrorism with a colleague of mine named Doug Karpoloff. Doug was the director of security for the World Trade Center. And after this first attack, he trained people on getting out of the building without the elevators working, blocking stairwells, taking their phones away, challenging them. 9/11 happens on 2001. I'm in the gym, and the first plane crashes into the building. And I heard the same as Secretary Condoleezza Rice, it was a smaller plane. And I said, that's not on the flight path to JFK. Because I grew up in Jersey, and so you know, they don't fly over that part of Manhattan. When the second plane went into the building, it was time to go to work. And as I got to work, I called the network that Doug and I were working with to make the videotape, and they said the last time anybody saw him, he was on his cell phone walking into the building to get people out, and he never came out. So I lost Doug that day. But I tell this story for two reasons. One is to honor Doug, and two is to let you know that until recently, we have DNA evidence from possibly 11 people, but until recently, everybody below the point of impact in those two towers, except for those brave firefighters and police officers who ran up to get people out, got out. And they got out because they knew what to do when they were challenged when things didn't work well. And so those are the kinds of adaptations we have to make as time goes forward. We also saw a lot of other things on 9/11. We saw these kinds of pronouncements pop up on the internet. Hallelujah, may the war be started. Death to his enemies, may the World Trade Center burn to the ground. We're thinking it's Al-Qaeda. We're thinking it's Muslim extremists. Well, how about this? It's August Crease, a Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan in Pennsylvania, who actually reached out to Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was #2 at that time, to Osama bin Laden, and said, we're willing to partner with you the cells are in place here in America, we have the same enemy. So I often show you this so we understand just what we're dealing with regards to the threat and those people who engage. Fortunately for us, Ayman al-Zawahiri and people in Al-Qaeda blew off this offer and never took him up on it.
You good?
Okay. Time out. Any better? No? One?
Yeah.
You guys are fine?
Yes.
So if you're just recording with this and they can hear me, I think we're going to be okay. Thank you so much. I just want to make sure at the end of the night we don't have a video that doesn't have any audio. One of the things Brian didn't mention in my bio, and I get to remind myself how old I am now, but I was a drill instructor in the police academy, so believe me, I can talk a block away because I've screamed and yelled at people for years without a mic. The scary thing is now I run into these chiefs who say, "You were my drill instructor in the academy." And I go, "Oh God, how old am I?" Okay. So, one of the challenges we have globally is there is no definition of terrorism. Do me a favor, when you're bored, take a look at the federal agencies in the United States that are charged with investigating, prosecuting, preventing, detecting, deterring terrorism, and you will not find two federal agencies in this country that have the same definition of terrorism. Needless to say, we do not have a definition internationally. That is a huge problem. That is a huge dilemma because we can't agree on what it is. What I've done is this. I believe we can talk about three things. The essence of the activity is violence. Now, I differ with my dear friend Boaz Ganur, who's in Israel, who happened to be on my doctoral committee, and I teach in his school every year for 2 weeks in Herzliya. I believe if you have the threat of violence or violence, you've got enough. He says if you have a threat, we don't have terrorism. There has to be a violent act. But let's agree that it's violence. So a peaceful demonstration or protest is not terrorism. The number of people killed does not make it terrorism. When we had the former police officer a couple years ago, and his name escapes me right now, Dorner was committing acts across Los Angeles several years ago, and he happened to kill one of our police officers from the University of Southern California. And they wanted me to come on TV and talk about Dorner being a terrorist. I said, he's not a terrorist. He's a former employee who's disgruntled and upset with LAPD. With all due respect to the fact that he's killing people methodically, that does not make him a terrorist. Why not? Because the targets of the activity, in his case, were civilians, and the targets have to be civilians. But more importantly, the essence and objective of the activity has to be political. There's got to be some kind of political nexus to it, or else you don't have terrorism. The individual who walked into the theater in Aurora, Colorado, as tragic as it was, and a number of people that lost their lives, was not a terrorist. There are still mass murderers. There are still people that do things that are not connected in any way to any political agenda or any kind of ideology that they're attached to. Let me tell you why I have challenges with the fact that we don't have a definition. There are acts of terrorism happening in the United States that you never hear about because we suffer from this disease I call otherism. We're very comfortable when the threat is someone other than us, either other race, other religion, other nationality, other gender. But when it's one of us, we tend to kind of shy away and call it a lone gunman or a deranged killer or someone suffering from mental illness. Andrew Joseph Stack is a sovereign citizen. I'm going to talk more about them tonight. Sovereigns, by the way, believe that the United States government is not legitimate. They don't pay taxes. They have their own driver's licenses. They have their own license plates. Unfortunately now, they've even agreed that they don't have to comply with law enforcement officers who stop them on something as simple as a traffic stop, to the point of confronting them violently if they must. Andrew decided he wasn't going to pay taxes. Finally, he gets a notice from the IRS. He's upset. So, he writes a manifesto, and for you psych majors in here, you got to tell me why all these people write manifestos, okay? I haven't figured that out. But he writes a manifesto. He burns his house to the ground. He's a pilot. He goes to the airfield, gets in his two-seater plane, and flies his plane into the federal building in Austin, Texas, killing a gentleman who was sitting at his desk at work that morning and himself. So let's go back. Violence. Innocent civilian killed, including himself. Sovereign citizen, never called a terrorist. Those are some of the challenges we have. By the way, Austin, Texas, the capital of Texas, and how many people in here have ever heard of this incident? I rest my case, other than the dean. I rest my case. So that's some of the challenges we have. Let's talk about what's happening. Homegrown extremists tied to deadlier toll since 9/11. And I'm going to talk about some stats. Yes, sir.
Why was this not considered a political act? Because he was protesting the government of the United States.
Because this happened at a time, and as we are now, laser focused on people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I always joke with my audiences and say, if his name had been Andrew Muhammad, we would have been all over this. We would have shut down general aviation as we know it, and you'd all know who he is. His name would be household. So very good question. And that's what I mean about otherism. And I can give you other examples of incredible things that have happened on days that you should all know about, and you don't know a thing about it. And I'll give you one. Remind me, I'll give you another one that I don't have a slide for. Since 9/11, 48 people killed in this country by extremists who are not Muslim, 26 killed by self-proclaimed jihadists. So you can see what's happened over time. What does this correspond with?
The recession.
The recession, what else? Come on, guys.
After the election.
The election of the first African-American president. And a Democrat. If you go back and look during the Clinton administration and you look during the Obama administration, this uptick in especially militia activity, anti-government activity is not an aberration. It happens. It happens. So let me give you some other examples here. James von Brunn walks into the Holocaust Museum in Washington and kills the security officer there. Known anti-Semite, known neo-Nazi, and I guess he died either last year or the year before in prison. He was in his late 70s or early 80s when he did this. Richard Deere was the abortion clinic shooter. He killed a Iraqi war vet, an off-duty police officer, and a mom of two. Never called a terrorist. Known anti-abortionist. Kevin Harpham was caught by the FBI. He planned to blow up the Martin Luther King Day parade. He had remote-controlled devices. He was going to explode those IEDs with remote, and he had laced them with rat poison. Anybody know why he laced IEDs with rat poison? You're going to learn a lot more here tonight than you thought. Why do we lace them with rat poison after you put all the ball bearings and marbles in there for shrapnel? Yes?
Is it because it prevents the clotting of the blood when you're trying to...
Exactly. It's an anticoagulant. So, if you don't get killed by the blast, you can bleed out. He got caught. Michael Wade Page, in front of his swastika, attacked the Sikh temple because unbeknownst to some of these people, and I'm being very politically correct because I'm being recorded right now, I have names for them. They don't understand that Sikhs are not Muslims. Not that that makes it okay, but they attack Sikhs more than Muslims because they see a turban and they think, oh, Muslim, oh, terrorist. He went in and killed women and children in the Sikh temple, doing nothing more than praying. And then Dylan Ruff from Charleston, South Carolina, who walked in, sat in the congregation in the First AME Emmanuel Church for an hour, killed 9 people, left one person alive to tell the story. That flag and some other images will tell you his life story. He acted because he believed that people like the Klan weren't doing enough. Someone should do something. And again, my challenge with this, and I'm not an attorney, Dylan Ruff wasn't prosecuted for terrorism. Dylan Ruff was prosecuted as a hate crime. So for the attorneys in here, you'll have to tell me why we would choose a hate crime when he fulfilled, according to the Attorney General, all of the requirements to be classified as a domestic terrorist. Here's what it looks like now. By the way, 2015 was the deadliest year we've had domestically since Timothy McVeigh crashed his bomb and his truck into the Murrah building in 1995. Last year. And you can see here the percentages. White supremacists, 38%. Anti-government extremists, 37%. Domestic Islamic extremism, 37%. We keep a laser focus on ISIS. I'm going to show you some other things. Anti-government extremism, and a lot of these are hybrids and bleed over. And I'm going to show you some hybrids tonight that almost don't even make sense of what people log on to. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Obama factor is huge. When I was the Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence at LAX, dignitary protection was under my command, along with special weapons and some other groups. We protect every foreign dignitary that comes into the United States from all over the world. We quadrupled our efforts with Secret Service and other agencies when he was a candidate because he got so many threats. He received 30 threats per day his first year in office as compared to George W. Bush, who received about 8. The increase in patriot groups and armed militias in the first 3 years of his administration was a 755% increase in their membership. I remember going to a website for the National Socialist Movement, that's the fastest growing and deadliest neo-Nazi organization in the United States. They had a photograph of him and Rahm Emanuel on their homepage, and it said, "Our worst fears have come true, African-American president, and he has a Jew for his chief of staff." And he used it as a recruiting tool. So what's this pathway look like? And why does it happen? There's a couple of things that are requirements, I think, in terms of becoming radicalized, becoming recruited. And radicalized is an incredibly overused term as well. But you've got an alienated individual. Well, degrees of alienation, depending on whether or not you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist, vary. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean you have mental illness. It could just mean that you're disenfranchised from the fold. A legitimizing ideology, which today can be almost anything, and can be a hybrid of things, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And then, most importantly, the one item that gives us some leverage is an enabling environment. That's the only element of the three that I think we can actually influence. These things don't happen in a vacuum. I always jokingly say, every terrorist has a family. They have a community. Unless they isolate themselves, there's somebody who knows. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who's one of the two brothers in the Boston Marathon bombings, bragged about not having any friends. That wasn't an accident. That was by design. If you look here, what you see is Mrs. Tsarnaev, their mom, at her first press conference where she said, first, my sons didn't do it. She says, my sons were framed by the FBI. And if you read a book by Masha Gessen, who got the first and only rights to do the story, there's an actual theory in the back of that book that's floating that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was an FBI asset. By the way, and for those of you who don't know, when we do drugs or drug investigations, you're an informant. In the intelligence community and the foreign counterintelligence community, you're an asset. They believed he was an asset, and the rumor was that he was an asset for the FBI, and the reason we hunted him down the way we did in Boston was to kill him before he was able to get caught and say, I used to work for the Bureau. So if you believe that, she believes that, and you can see where the enabling environment certainly works for a guy like Tsarnaev when he went there to the Caucasus region before he came back to the United States. He has a mom there who supported everything that he did. I think that there's an interesting moment for people who want to engage, and we call it a cognitive opening. Quentin Torres wrote a book on, he's a fabulous author, and he came up with this theory of what's called a cognitive opening. And you can see here where previously held beliefs are shaken, making an individual receptive to alternative ideas. Timothy McVeigh is the classic example of the cognitive opening. If you know anything about McVeigh, other than the Murrah building, he was in the military, he was in the army, he wanted to be in special forces, and he got rejected. He got rejected because he failed the physical, but he blamed it on affirmative action in the army and the fact that they wanted, he says, they wanted more minorities and women than they wanted me. He failed the physical. Then he went on and hooked up with a group called CSA, Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord, a Christian identity group that was also an anti-government group. He worked with them. He showed up at Waco. He was selling anti-government bumper stickers and t-shirts that day, and when that incident happened, he said, I've had enough. The United States government killed women and children. I'm going to do something. That was his cognitive opening. That was his moment. And then he decided to go to the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. By the way, he chose the Murrah building in Oklahoma City because he believed some of the first responders at Waco would be some of the same first responders at the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, and he wanted to teach them a lesson. If you ask law enforcement, and we have twice now in the last 2 years, what do you worry about most? And Brian, you'll find this interesting. When you ask the average police officer what he or she fears the most with regards to their personal safety each day, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not ISIS, it's not Al-Shabaab. Number one, it's sovereign citizens, anti-government people. So, we had a report that came out in the Department of Homeland Security in 2009. I happened to be a nominee at the time. I wish I could have told Secretary Napolitano, this title is a non-starter. And the title was Rightwing Extremism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was blasted by the right. It talked about how right-wing extremism was increasing. It talked about how guys and women returning from the Middle East at war were prime targets for recruitment. She withdrew the report, disbanded the unit, apologized to the military, and we thought it all went away. The next year, Sergeant Potter and his partner Bill Evans stopped Jerry and Joseph Kane, a father and son team of sovereigns, traveling around the countryside for putting on $100 a head seminars on how not to pay your taxes. Dad comes out with the fake driver's license, and as the officer's talking to him, Jerry pops out of the passenger side of the vehicle with an AK-47 and starts shooting at him. Drops him. Evans comes out of the car. Jerry shoots and drops him, and they take off. Thank God some citizens saw the firefight, got in the police car and said, 2 of your officers are down. There's a pursuit, another firefight, they injure another officer, another pursuit, they're finally neutralized at the end of the second pursuit. The chief goes out to the scene and doesn't know that his son, Chief Potter's son, is one of the officers that's been killed in the line of duty till he gets there. He now has a training video on sovereign citizens that's free to law enforcement and to anyone else who wants to learn what they're all about, and says to this day, if that report had been out there, my son and his partner may still be alive. Muslim extremists. And so recently this year, we had an incident in Philadelphia. Officer Jesse Hartnett's in the white police vehicle. Edward Archer's approaching the vehicle, shooting at him. Hartnett takes 10 rounds in his left arm as he puts it up against the window to shield himself, is able to return fire, hitting Archer in the hip and drops him. The whole time, he's saying afterwards, when he's caught, I'm following Allah and pledges allegiance to ISIS. This is never called a terrorist incident. This guy's not being charged with terrorism. So again, I have my challenges with what else do we need when we talk about terrorism and we talk about homegrown violent extremism. The third item on the list of police officers' concerns are anti-government and armed militias. And you probably all have never heard of this incident. Las Vegas, several years ago, a man named Jared Miller, they walk into a pizza place where Soldo and Beck are sitting there eating pizza, and they execute the two of them. They take their weapons, they drop 2 flags, one on each body. The swastika on one, and the Gadsden flag that says, don't tread on me, on the other. They walk across the street to Walmart. They walk into Walmart, Jared puts a round in the ceiling and says, everybody get out. As they're running out of Walmart, there's a citizen in Walmart that has a CCW, carrying concealed weapon permit. He sees Jared, he's going to take Jared out. He walks up behind Jared to take him out. He doesn't know Jared's wife is 10 feet behind him pushing a cart full of the other weapons. She kills him. They wind up barricading themselves in the Walmart. SWAT kills Jared. Amanda takes her own life. Anybody here ever heard of this incident? Okay, good. Police officers are getting killed in the line of duty by a whole host of people now, but they're getting killed at a rate of 59 people. I'm sorry, one person every 59 hours. And it's something that's not being reported or even mentioned. And in some of these instances, it's extremists like this. Last but not least, we had this happen earlier this year in January. We had a building takeover by these individuals. They were finally captured. One of them said he wouldn't be taken alive, and he wasn't. Fortunately, we had video that showed that he tried to draw down on FBI SWAT. He got killed. Will we see more of these? I don't know. Everything's changed since when I was in SWAT, the old days, and you do what we did at Waco. We'd surround it and try to talk to them and eventually storm the building. In this case, they just left them alone. I remember the governor calling and asking the director Comey of the FBI, get these guys out of there. They had no hostages, leave them alone. And we just ignored them. Their call for assistance to other organizations like theirs went largely ignored. Then they started to get cold, they started to get hungry, and it all worked in our favor, and it worked out. Will we do that again? I don't know, but in this case, it worked. I had intended to go up there because I wanted to talk to some of the guys on the perimeter that were with this group, and I just wanted to say, I wanted to do some interviews because I'm writing another book. I was going to say, listen, I've seen these Whidbey Island, Waco, Ruby Ridge. This is going to end bad for you. But fortunately, I never had that conversation, and 6 of them wound up coming out alive. Several years ago, November 1st, Paul Ciancia goes to LAX asking people, do you work for the TSA? That was his agenda. He had written a letter to Secretary Napolitano about how much he hated the Department of Homeland Security. He also was a New World Order theorist about the world being run by Jews. He stopped people, and when they said they weren't with the TSA, he just kept on going. He winds up killing Hernandez, who was a TSA officer. And again, as I mentioned earlier, SWAT and special weapons have changed. The old days where you hold and get a hostage negotiator and you talk. Today, you take people on. And one of my former officers very bravely took on Ciancia in the upper level of the terminal and shot him, and now he's going to be going to court here soon. Very, very brave, considering that he was still firing at people when he was finally shot. But the point here is, here's a guy who's an anti-government extremist who went to the airport looking for the TSA. There's your political objective right there. But let's just see what he gets charged with. Unbeknownst to many of you, that we've had some hybrids in the past. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, you all know about his connection to Muslim or Islamic extremism. But after he was killed, we found out some very interesting things. He believed the 9/11 and Oklahoma City bombings were government conspiracy, that we actually performed those actions ourselves. He said he was a Second Amendment advocate and said the government is raping our gun rights. And most importantly, he says Hitler had a point. So he was a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier. So we're looking now at a Muslim extremist who's also a Holocaust denier. It works for them. And so we're seeing now violent extremists who are checking off the boxes for those ideologies that they can get traction with. There is no profile. And that's my point of this part of the conversation. There's no profile. So when I say people, hear people say, we want a profile, what are you looking for? If you want to know what America looks like, what a terrorist in America looks like, hold up a mirror to America. There's your pool of people. And with the exception of a certain age demographic, there's your pool. I've seen a number of these individuals that appear to lock on to the fact that they hate the United States and they hate the state of Israel. That seems to be a common meeting point for them. And that works for them. And it worked for him. Any questions? Yeah, we're too quiet. Yes?
So I noticed one profile with all the attackers, and they were all white. And I noticed that law enforcement is very homogenous as well. Do you think that your role as a person of color, you were able to overcome that racial bias and kind of look at it from an outsider's point of view?
Well, but let me just back you up a little bit. Good, very good question. Mm-hmm. But one of the things is they're actually not all white. I've had, Muslim extremists from all races.
Yeah.
I've had sovereign citizens. By the way, there's a whole collection of African American sovereign citizens who, interestingly enough, belong to the Moorish Science Temple, which, by the way, the Moorish Science Temple has publicly disavowed any connection to sovereign citizens, but we do see that. But good question. You do have, I will say this, you tend to see more of what you're suggesting in mass murderers than you do in domestic terrorists. So you do see that. But was I able to? The answer to that question is yes. I did a foreign fighter study I'm going to talk about here a little bit later in Minnesota, and I worked with a Somali community there, and they at one point said, "You're an African American, you know what it's like to be profiled." And they told me things that they had not told other researchers because I looked the way I looked. Now, keep in mind, the disadvantage was having worked for the FBI, and they're not big fans of the FBI. So for them to feel that level of comfort based on skin color was interesting, but I still had to get over that hurdle of working for an agency that they have some challenges with when it comes to trust. But good question. So I think this probably demonstrates my point most accurately with as it relates to profiles. This is I'm doing a lot of work in the prisons, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I've been going to a number of prisons here in California. This individual's in one of our institutions here. He's a North Side gang member. He's a male Hispanic. So he goes into prison as a gangster. And he goes into prison as a Satan worshiper, so he's got 666 on his back. While he's in prison, he converts to Islam. Now, there's 3 food groups in prison: Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Typically, you're going to join one of those 3 if you want to stay alive. He joins Nuestra Familia, but in joining Nuestra Familia, he also decides to convert to Islam. Well, having tattoos in the Muslim religion is taboo. So he figures, since I've got my back already tattooed, I'm not going to remove it. I'll dedicate my back to Osama bin Laden. This is when bin Laden was still alive. So I often jokingly ask people, how do you profile a Mexican devil-worshipping Muslim? I mean, because he's been in all 3. How do you profile a kid like this? And this works for him. So there is no profile. Let me give you another, for instance, and I don't have a photograph. The Aryan Brotherhood are the white supremacists in the correctional system in the United States. 2 of their members 3 years ago converted to Islam. We still can't figure that out. We don't know why that happened. We don't know what the plan is. We don't know if it's a business model. We don't know if they really are embracing Islam. We don't know. But that's like, I can say this because my wife's a Bruin. That would be like me sitting at a UCLA football game and cheering for them. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And so when we hear these stories, there is no profile, and the hybrids are astounding sometimes. I say that because, and I often remind people, we thought we had a profile after World War II. It was called the Japanese. And we interned 110,000 Japanese American citizens who had never done anything except live and work here. 1/3 of them were children. Many of them were separated from their families when they got interned. And if you do your research, there were, I believe, 4 people arrested for espionage during that war, and none of them were of Japanese or Asian descent. So when we think we have a profile and we want to go down this road again, we should think about this really hard. Now we have a different issue and a different enemy that gets, in my opinion, a lot of attention. Deservedly so in most cases, but to the exclusion of others that I've mentioned this evening, in Daesh or ISIS or ISIL, depending on what you want to call it. It is a challenge. It is a global challenge, and we don't know. At this point, this is their map. What you can't see there is the red over Africa, over Saudi, and over parts of Asia, and who knows if it stops there. But it's a challenge for us because now not only are they asking people to come and fight in Syria, they're telling people to stay and fight where they are. And that's a real challenge for us in the counterterrorism community. I did a study in Minneapolis last year because Minneapolis is the largest Somali community outside of the country of Somalia. It had an extraordinary number of young men who left in 2008, 2009 to fight for Al-Shabaab in Somalia. In 2014, young men who were born here were leaving to fight in Syria for ISIS. That does not make much sense. When they've got no nationality or connection to that country, why would they go and fight there? And ISIS is becoming very successful in recruiting them over there. A couple of things that we found out. I know you guys all hear about online recruiting. I have bad news for you. Nobody's going home, sitting in their bedroom by themselves, getting online, and then going out and buying a ticket to Turkey. That is not how it works. And we found in Minnesota that face-to-face recruitment is very, very important to this process, and it's happening. What does that mean? That means that ISIS is on the ground in the United States. And when I was in Minnesota, we found locations where the recruiting actually happens, where people actually meet. And unbeknownst, again, to the American public, it is not happening in the mosque. If you want to get caught today, walk in the mosque and say something extreme. Before you get to your car, the FBI will be there to open the door for you. Because of the imams that I've met across the country, they are locked into the FBI. And the last thing they want is to have someone think that their place of worship is being used as a recruiting center. So, unfortunately, they've moved away from the mosques for the recruiting efforts, and it's become quite successful for them. Social media does support the effort. So I can go to the mosque, I can go to the place and meet with a person who's trying to talk to me about, or trying to teach me how to understand Islam, but I can go online and talk to thousands of people who feel the same way I do. But I can do that with extreme Islam, I can do that with anti-Semitism, I can do that with sovereign citizens. But the face-to-face in this case is very important. Rabbi Cooper runs the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and it's connected to the Museum of Tolerance in LA. And he's a staunch advocate and proponent of going after Facebook and Twitter. We always find it interesting that if you violate a trademark on one of these social media networks, they'll lock onto you in about a minute. But if you put a beheading on there, it'll stay on there for several days. Why is that? And so he's been going after them for these people who make these posts. They have a whole unit there that goes after hate websites, but in particular now they're also going after Twitter and Facebook to have them be a little bit more diligent about taking some of these posts and the people that are putting them up there, taking them down. Here we go. So let's talk about how prolific social media and connectivity can be. Al-Hazmi and Al-Madar, they're going to come up, but I want to talk about them individually. Al-Hazmi and Al-Madar were in San Diego. They were hiding in plain sight. They were there before 9/11. Anwar al-Awlaki, who's in the middle, connected with them in San Diego. They moved to DC. They connected with Hani Hanjour. I tell this story because another friend that I lost was the brother of the pilot on Flight 77 that crashed into the Pentagon. His name was Chuck Burlingame. And for those of you in the class, anybody here know what a challenge coin is? A couple people? So I have a big collection. Challenge coins are real big in the military. They're big in law enforcement. There's a tradition where you've got a challenge coin that represents your unit or your agency, and you shake hands with someone and you give them the challenge coin, and if they don't have one, they have to buy you a beer. Okay, so in my case, they buy me a sparkling water, but in any event. So this challenge coin has the Pentagon on the front, and then on the back it has the Pentagon with the flag that was draped over it after the plane crashed in. This challenge coin was given to me by Brad Burlingame, who was Chuck's brother, who they forced his flight into the Pentagon that day. Zachary, Adam Cheshire at the top, protesting there in front of the White House because of the cartoons about Muhammad. Abdul Muttalib on Christmas Day in 2009, in fact when I was a nominee, he was the underwear bomber. Michael Fenton, who's also known as Talib Islam, who was going to blow up a congressional office in Illinois when he was caught. Almonte and Alisa down at the lower left were caught when they were going to leave on a flight from JFK to Egypt, and then from Egypt on to Turkey. because they were going to fight overseas. Nadal Hassan, who you all know from Fort Hood, and Rashana Chowdhury, who stabbed Stephen Cresswell Timms, who was a member of British Parliament because he voted to support the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Who did they all have in common? But in only 3 cases never met, Anwar al-Awlaki. In fact, Rashana Chowdhury and Zachary Adam Cheshire, when they were caught, had sermons of al-Awlaki on their cell phones. This guy was incredibly prolific. Why do I show him to you? Because he's an American. He was born in New Mexico. Studied in Colorado, had a master's degree, I believe, from San Diego, and was supposedly going to enroll in the doctoral program in D.C. It was either American or Georgetown. The guy was a rock star. And had he not been an American, he may have been a successor to bin Laden. There's a whole other controversy which we can talk about another time, because he's the first authorized kill that we actually put out for a drone strike. And I used to say to people, you do not want to get in the car with Anwar al-Awlaki. And Anwar al-Awlaki was killed by a 500-pound laser-guided bomb. And also in the car that day was an individual named Samir Khan, who was also an American, who was the editor-in-chief of Al-Qaeda's magazine, Inspire. Talking about Inspire, these people do their homework. So I'm at home one Friday evening. I get a call from some old friends in the FBI, and they say, you know Inspire magazine? I say, yeah, I read all of them. They go, you're in tomorrow's issue. Didn't make my wife real happy. In any event, they have a section there called Hear the World. Every section, every issue, they profile 10 people. It's called Quotes from Friends and Foes, so I guess you can decide which side I was on. You've got Nadal Hassan, former FBI Director Mueller, President Obama, Cornel West, who's a professor at Harvard, Adam Gadon, another American from Orange County, who's a spokesperson for Al-Qaeda, who got killed by a drone strike earlier this year. And yours truly is down next to the bottom. That was exciting enough, but what really got my attention was the quote they had in there was an interview that I gave to a blog called Security Debrief. It's a national security blog on the Hill. I would be challenged if anybody in here ever knew about it other than Ali, because he reads it because he's connected to us. But if you ever heard of it or read it, they read it, they pulled a quote from it because I was talking about marathons being a soft target and how this is going to be difficult to protect in the future, and they used it. This was an issue that they pretty much dedicated to the Tsarnaev brothers and the attack on Boston. And they also glorified additional attacks on airports. So they had done enough research to find this quote, find the photo, and put it up there with everybody else. And they do this every issue. How does this work? I'm in Minnesota. I had the luck, after a lot of negotiations, to meet with a mom whose daughter had departed 3 months previously. 2 weeks before she left, her social media was totally shut down. Now, how many of you in here, not by a show of hands, could survive if you didn't have email, texting, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat? I mean, just imagine it being turned off. Hers was turned off for 2 weeks before she left. Mom didn't know that, but we found out afterward. She tells Mom she's going to a wedding shower on Friday. She's going to stay with a friend. She'll be back on Saturday night. Two days before she leaves, unbeknownst to Mom, there's about $3,000 deposited in her bank account. She's got another person's passport. People don't look at it that closely. She leaves. 2 days after she's supposed to be home, she texts her sister at home and says, I'm in Syria. Every several weeks, she's then escorted. She says that she's in a building with a lot of other women. They're not allowed to leave. Whenever they leave, they're escorted. They're escorted about every 2 to 3 weeks to an internet cafe, and they can communicate with family at home to say, we're still here, we're still alive, we're still fine, everything's wonderful, when we know it's not. And so we have an interesting dilemma in the United States as it relates to policy. There's a gentleman in Fresno who, this year, he saw something and said something about his son. He thought his son was being radicalized. He told the FBI. He wanted to get his son help. Unfortunately, he was further down a radicalization pathway than we thought. Electronic surveillance of his phone indicated that he wanted to shed blood for the cause, and he wanted to kill Americans. They stopped him at SFO when he was on his way to Turkey for the second time, allegedly on a humanitarian effort to lend assistance there. They turned him around, and several days later they went to his house. He's now facing 20 years for support of ISIS. So the question we have to ask ourselves as Americans, is there some place between a plane ticket and prison that we can work with people? I'm working with a group now out of Germany. It's called Exit Germany, and it's called Hayat. They have a counseling service, and as long as we can prove that these folks are not foreign fighters that are battle trained, they're working with people to get them a whole collection of social services, which up to and including prosecution, if that's the way we have to go, to keep them from becoming radicalized, and especially to keep them from departing to fight someplace else. We're going to have to cross that line here. If we think that Americans have not gone to fight, I'm going to show you one who did. If we think Americans have not gone to fight and come back home, then we're more naive than people think we are. When I talk to people in the community, I said, what do we need to do here? What helps? And one of the mistakes that researchers make is, and I always say this, the government has a very bad habit doing this. We go into a community and want to do surgery before we do the physical exam. We don't get to know anybody. We don't know the landscape. We don't know what their challenges are. The number one challenge in the Somali community in Minnesota is not going to Somalia or to Syria. It's gang violence. No different than some other major cities. So that's what we talked about most often. But in any case, community engagement was top on their list with regards to what to do, and parent education awareness was second. What kinds of programs do we have there now? The West Bank Athletic Club. I'm going to watch guys play soccer there that are so challenged that they're sharing soccer shoes to play. And so we chipped in and bought shoes. We chipped in, I guess you're surprised here, they all have USC t-shirts now. We chipped in and got shirts, but I mean, these kids told me, they said, if we weren't here in the afternoon playing soccer, and by the way, I guess some of this activity for recruitment happens at the mall, they said, we'd be down at the mall with those other guys. Thank God we have the coach, and he does this for us. I drove a couple of guys home one night after practice, and we take them to this place, and it's a really nice looking building, and I dropped them off, and the coach says to me, nice building, huh? I said, yeah. He says, they stay there because those guys are homeless. And when they turn 18, they can't stay there anymore. So then what do they do? It's very challenging. So thank God we have the West Bank Athletic Club. I'm working with a gentleman named Muhammad Ahmed. He started the Average Muhammad cartoon series. I really love this guy because he had an incredible idea, and he came out of his pocket. He works at 7-Eleven. He's funding it himself. He says, we need to target people when they're watching SpongeBob. And he's right. We said, he started getting a lot of notoriety. CNN, NBC. People were sending him money from all over the world. He says, what do I do with this? He says, you need to start a nonprofit. So we started a nonprofit called AverageMuhammad.com. Justin's a fellow researcher of mine, and we sit on his board. Google is now funding us, and we're pumping out cartoons as fast as they can be animated. And then last but not least, there's a whole collection of women in the Somali community that are disenfranchised from this entire process. So Officer Alice White, who's with the Minneapolis Police Department, she started a program called Somali Women and Women in Law Enforcement, and she also started a Minneapolis Police Department youth safety camp that happens every summer. They had a lot of murders that were going unsolved in Minneapolis. Why? Because there's a culture, in Somalia, when something happens, families work it out. So, if Brian killed me, and the police came and said what happened, everybody in the community would say nothing, because what would happen in the background is Brian's family would talk to my family, and they'd sit with the elders in the community, and they would decide what his family had to do to make amends for my absence for the rest of my life, and they'd work it out. So when the police came to solve this murder, they had nothing to go on. And it happened largely because, guess what? No Somali police officers. Now that they have enough police officers, Somali officers, to have their own Somali Police Officer Association, they are now solving murders because they feel like, I can talk to somebody who looks like me. I can talk to somebody who came from a country like mine. And it's working. And it's no different than the United States when law enforcement agencies tend to reflect the communities they serve. Things tend to be a little bit better. Last I'm going to talk about is Paris. And then we'll do questions. I was fortunate enough because of the work that I did in Minneapolis to get invited to Paris because if you haven't noticed those attacks there, those guys are all homegrown. January 2015, Charlie Hebdo. 13/11 when it happened in November. Brussels, those guys were all Frenchmen and they were all Belgians. They were not imports from some other country. They have the same challenges that we do. That's what it looks like over there now. No different than Union Station, Penn Station, any place around the world. And we're now used to this. They never thought they would have to get to this point. They're worried about their tourism industry. They're worried about a lot of things. I met with military personnel, law enforcement people, counterintelligence, intelligence community, forensic psychiatrists. I sat with them in this meeting and we talked about radicalization for an hour and a half. And now we're going to be doing some research together. The University of Lyon put this on, and they're actually building a degree program on extremism, radicalization, and forensic psychiatry. They're starting to move into that realm of, can we work with these guys before they get radicalized and want to leave the country? Here's the first American. Monir was from Florida. There he is before he burned his United States passport. Here he is when he's getting ready to make his video. And there he is, one of 3 vehicles that exploded simultaneously at 3 different locations that day when he blew himself up. I showed him to show you this. Jahar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev at the Boston bombing, no foreign training. Gadal Hassan at Fort Hood, no foreign training. The San Bernardino shooters. So my challenge is this, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to the first and only congressional hearing to testify in the Boston Marathon bombings. What I talked about that day was not how this happened, but why this happens and why it will happen again. I often, and I say this for a reason, as apolitical as I try to remain, and so do my colleagues, as we tend to be laser focused on immigrants that may come here. I'm not worried about immigrants that may come here. I'm worried about people that were born here and people that live here. And I think we need to really understand and recognize the threat for what it is. We've got an organization like ISIS telling people, don't come to Syria. Attack where you are. And we're seeing evidence of that. Al-Qaeda tried to do the same thing. They weren't quite as successful. The latest study that was put together by the New America Foundation several months ago says the threat from returning jihadis is actually low. This is a guy who was an American, turned himself in, and we're getting a tremendous amount of information from him. But the fact that they are returning, I can tell you why they're not returning, by the way. It's not because they don't want to. I saw, and I don't put these in slides because they're too graphic, they've been burying guys alive who want to defect from ISIS. If they think you're with a Western agency, aka the CIA, they will kill you automatically. They make a practice of anytime they don't trust you, they kill you. Anytime you try to defect, they kill you. So the reason that people aren't defecting and getting back here is not because they don't want to come back, it's because they can't. Some women have been somewhat more successful, and there's an art to that I don't want to say on video about how it's done, but I'm working with people on how it's done. But it's very, very difficult once you get there to leave there. Last section. The most dangerous plot we had in America after 9/11 and before Boston took place in LA, and it was based in a prison, and it involved former gang members, ex-cons, and guys who never had been arrested for as much as stealing a pack of gum. So you've got Kevin James, the mastermind, who's in prison, former gangster, was in the Nation of Islam, converts to Islam, decides they're not Muslim enough for me, I'm going to start my own group. and he calls it JIS, which translates as the Assembly of Authentic Islam. He recruits LeVar Washington. These guys are rival Crip gang members outside of prison. When they get in prison, it's all about race. And so they start working together. Washington swears allegiance to James. Washington's going to be paroled in 6 months. James says, I need you to recruit 5 guys, no criminal history, for the plan. And the plan is, as he writes this in prison, is going to attack a dozen National Guard centers in LA, the El Al ticket counter at LAX, the Israeli consulate, and about a half dozen synagogues. Washington goes to the mosque in Inglewood. He meets Hamad Samana, who's a Pakistani national who's attending Santa Monica College. And he meets Gregory Patterson, who's working at LAX at the time and has an application into my department to become a police officer. Because why? Both these guys have no criminal histories. So guess who did the intel and background work on the airport attack? Gregory. Long story short, these 2 guys are neophytes. Washington's a hardcore gangster. We got to get them battle trained. They start engaging in gas station robberies. The 10th robbery, Patterson drops his cell phone. We get it. The officer who gets it is from the Torrance Police Department. They serve a search warrant. They get to the location. They find automatic weapons, bomb-making materials, maps, photos of bin Laden. He's on a Joint Terrorism Task Force and says, this is not what guys who would be robbing gas stations would have. He calls the Joint Terrorism Task Force. One of my colleagues is a special agent in charge of counterterrorism, calls Washington. We dropped 500 agents on this case. When they went out to do gas station robbery 11, we were there. Took them into custody, and we find out they were 8 weeks from going operational. They were going to line up the attacks with Yom Kippur and around the time of the anniversary of 9/11. Why do I tell you this story? Because these 2 guys had never done anything like this in their lives. Hamad Samana, by the way, was deported back to Pakistan, and Gregory Patterson, who I think I have a slide to show you in a moment. Gregory's coming out of jail on June 21st. He served 10 years. By the way, LeVar Washington, when he's caught, is speaking fluent Arabic, and when they ask him where he's from, he says, I'm from Sudan. Now, nobody ever said these guys were smart. What you can't see on LeVar's forehead is a tattoo that says Rolling 60s. So he was self-taught in Arabic in prison. And the fact that he says he's from Sudan really didn't fly because he's got a tattoo that says LA Rolling 60s on his head. I tried to get a hold of Gregory for years. I had some luck finally. I've been to all the prisons that these guys were in. The short version of this story is that I wrote Gregory. I tried to appeal to him as a father with a son a year younger than him that went to a Catholic high school like he did. And my son went this way and Gregory went that way. And I said, tell me how that happened. And it worked. He writes back and says, I'm interested in discussing what happened to me leading to my incarceration, as well as warning and educating the general public in regards to the destructive dangers that result from the spreading of extremist ideology. We'll see. Still got my fingers crossed. We'll see. But maybe a breakthrough. I've been working on this for about a decade, so we'll see. Last slide. We are going to be hosting a global summit on Homegrown Violent Extremism next year. It's going to be a follow-up to the summit they had in Dublin and the summit that the president had earlier this year. We're going to have formers there, meaning former extremists. We're going to have community people there. We're going to have, obviously, government people there. And we want to have some action items to come out of there. One of the things we'd love to come out of there with is a definition of what this is. And also we want to try to tackle this issue of what we can do other than sending people to prison. Christian Picciolini's partnered with me on this. Christian's a former neo-Nazi. He's in a group called Life After Hate. David Valette, I can't get David here. David, that's us in Lyon, in France. David's a former jihadist and a bomb maker. David's now working with the government in France. And these guys can tell you what it takes to not go down that road because they've been down the road. And this is Hayat Exit Germany in Berlin. They had that successful program that we're partnered with. We're going to see if we can start a Hayat USA. We've got to come up with another way to deal with this. Because as we often say, in the counterterrorism business. We can't kill and arrest our way to success. Last thing I'm going to give you guys, what would this be without an acronym? So, social networks, I think I've emphasized tonight how important social networks are, physical and virtual. Take action. I'm just saying this to you so you understand. I know say something sounds really corny, but you guys get it. 40% of the cases that we solve are as a result of people who call because they saw something that didn't look right. So that's all I'm going to say. And you know when it doesn't look right. Intolerance, this could go a long way with a number of people that are clamoring for political office right now. It's just, again, it's all about intolerance, no matter whether it's based on race, whether it's based on religion, whether it's based on issue orientation. Intolerance is an issue. And then just educate yourself. Find out what's going on. I'm going to tell you one last story. On 2006, the 5th anniversary of 9/11, there was a gentleman named David McMenemy who was an anti-abortion advocate. And he had done surveillance on the Edgerton Women's Health Center in Iowa. He took a car bomb loaded with explosives and drove it through the front door to blow up the building. The car bomb didn't work. The car caught on fire. He got out, tried to douse it with gasoline to make it explode, and it never exploded, and he got caught. 5th anniversary of 9/11, a car bomb in a health center, which, by the way, despite his incredible surveillance work, was not an abortion clinic, nor did they refer people to abortion clinics. How many people in here have heard that story? I would think that 9/11 will always be a really important day in America. One news agency reported that story. It was the Associated Press, and nobody else covered it. On the 5th anniversary of 9/11, nobody in this room ever heard about it, and most of my colleagues never heard about it. But I dare say, had David been of another ethnicity, nationality, or religion, he probably would have heard about it. That's my problem with this. It doesn't get more graphic than that. You can't breathe hard on 9/11 without us knowing about it, and nobody knew. So, I'm going to end with that. One of the things I want to say as it relates to radicalization is that if someone goes down that path, our objective now is to make radicalization a phase in someone's life and not something that they're engaged in for the rest of their lives. And I think that we can do that. So I'm going to stop there. I went about 5 minutes over. I'm open for questions, and thank you guys for sitting here so patiently. So you're either hungry, tired, or you have no questions. Yes?
So when you're talking about the radicalization pathway and how it's from an alienated individual legitimizing ideology and then enabling environment, so do you think it's the environment that enables such alienation that they get to the point of legitimizing the ideology, or is it that becoming an alienated individual leads them to, for lack of a better way to put it, taking advantage?
That's a good question. It's a good question because, and no one's ever asked, that's really good because the way I have it on the slide gives the impression that it's linear, but it's not. The way you've described it is actually the way it is. You've got a person that's decided for whatever reason I'm disenfranchised. People don't like me, I'm not successful, I'm not popular, I'm not as smart as I want to be. Given that, now I've got this ideology that seems to be appealing to me, and I'm in this community of my friends or colleagues that are supportive of it, and it works. And they're mutually supportive of each other. I said that in that order because the alienation is something that's we can't control. We just can't. The legitimizing ideology, there are so many ideologies out there. In fact, by the way, in the California prison system, if you have a religion you believe in, they have to give you time in the chapel. Even if you're the only person who believes in it, you have a constitutional right. So legitimizing ideologies are as different as people are. But the fact that you have a community, whether it's mom and dad, brothers, sisters, friends, that say, you know, we support you in what you're doing, that's what makes it happen. And so what I didn't talk about tonight was a whole host of American terrorists whose families, friends, and in some cases congregations tried to pull them back into the fold, and they were unsuccessful. But that's the only real chance we have? That's a good question. They happen simultaneously. They're mutually supportive, but I wanted you to understand, and you did, that it's that community component that we really only have a chance to get them off the path if we can control that.
Thank you.
Good question. Yes, anybody else? Yes.
I just have a question. So, I kind of feel like, do you think that American people try scapegoating Muslims and not showing the American terrorists because they're afraid that a white person like themselves, or maybe just another American, would be doing this type of thing? They're more afraid. That's why they don't like cover it. To try to scapegoat us, that way they kind of like push themselves away.
I think we do, and I'll tell you why. You know, we've had the fortune of being protected by those two large bodies of water on each side called oceans. And so, I mean, I spend a lot of time in Israel. I've been there during 2 wars. Terrorism, unfortunately, can be a way of life. It doesn't change their lives, but they understand that there could be people who are Palestinians doing it, and there could be Jews who are doing it. We have not gotten to the level of understanding and accepting that Americans can do some of the things that, quote unquote, foreign terrorists do. And that's part of the big challenge, is we don't want to accept that we are capable nor have the desire to do this. I had this conversation with someone earlier today. We have not had a suicide attack in the United States, thank God. We have not had an attack on a train. We've thwarted a couple. Train attacks, by the way, dwarf airport and aviation incidents 4 times. So the reason for the scapegoating is, again, we want to believe we've got a foreign threat. We've got an external threat. And it's really easy when you could say it's them. It's people coming from there, somebody other than us. Americans don't do this. Well, we do. And it makes it easy when you can point to another race, another religion, or some other issue and kind of say, they're not really us. Well, they are. It's a very good question. And so that's why they get scapegoated. Good question. Okay? Yes, sir?
Do you think, in a way, that we're kind of creating our own enemies? Because I know, like, way back in the day, it was communism that was, you know, a really big threat. And that, in some way, by destabilizing regimes and trading communism for Islamic extremism, or, you know, in Latin America for drugs, that we've created our own enemies in a way?
I think to a certain extent we do that. It's unfortunate historically that people that we have partnered with previously become our enemies later. I mean, look, we funded the Mujahideen to take down the Russians. And then we've got those same shoulder-fired missiles being used against our own people in Somalia, in Black Hawk Down. So the Bin Laden family, by the way, if you don't know, they were in construction business. That's how they made their billions, their millions, billions. Short story, Mr. Bin Laden, Osama's dad, built the ramp to the, I don't know if you call him a prince. Anyway, the leader of the country was infirmed. He was on the 2nd floor. Dad built the ramp. He could get the limo up there. He could leave. You will now all have all the construction projects in the kingdom. There you have it. Guess who built the majority of our bases in the Middle East? The Bin Laden Construction Company. So we've been partnered with people that later on create problems. And then, of course, what I hear a lot of times is our foreign policy. Don't think for a second they're not using some of the rhetoric that's being put on TV right now. I don't suggest anybody do this in here because I don't want some of my friends to knock on your door. But if you were able to go to some of the websites for extremist organizations, especially from of the ISIS brand, you will see replays of speeches that have been made in the last 8 months by certain people being used as a recruiting tool. So that's not helping us. Good question. But unfortunately, the only thing we can do is partner with people that will give some stability. The only reason we were able to defeat Al-Qaeda in the first place was the fact that when we had the Anbar Awakening, Muslims decided, you know what, let me tell you a quick story. So ISIS started because of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And by the way, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq till we got there, okay? So we own part of that. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi did things that ISIS does now that we all find so reprehensible. He did routinely, to the point where Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was number 2 in Al-Qaeda, brought him in, admonished him and said, hey, you're killing too many Muslims. Knock it off. The beheadings, the amputations, blowing up people at weddings. He didn't comply. Lo and behold, several months later, we find out where he is and we drop a 500-pound bomb on him. I think that they gave him up. The point of that story is that when he was taken out of the equation for what is now ISIS and leading that group, based on what they had done to other Muslims, and people in the region decided they had had enough, they were able to have enough of an uprising to take them out, push them to the edge, and they were gone. When we left, they came back.
I also heard many reports of former Ba'athists in Saddam's army and the Republican Guard being part of ISIS, and you know a lot of their attacks are very orchestrated. You need training for that.
That's right, and you're right. So what we're seeing now are not ragtag armies like we believe. These are military trained personnel that know war, and they're very good at it. Okay? Anybody else? All right, well, again, I want to thank you guys for the invitation. Thank you for having me. And if there's anything that I can do with regards to this subject or public policy, please contact me. If you have an idea, or I sparked an idea based on what I talked about tonight, and you want to share it, I'm willing to listen, and I learn something new every day. So talk to me. Again, thank you guys. I really appreciate being here.
Well, as you can see, this is one of our prestigious seminars with a prestigious guest who I can call a friend and a colleague quite often. But we have a great program here at the master's degree level. I will use a term that I heard Erroll say. There definitely are rock stars, and as you can see, Dr. Southers is a rock star. So he is very open to getting to know you, and please use the tools and resources that he has given us. And thank you very much for attending this evening. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Again, I think Dr. Southers will be here for a few minutes. If you want to maybe say a few words in private or want to ask some questions. If you were a little nervous of asking questions, please feel free to stay a little bit and talk. So thanks again, and we appreciate your attendance.